This is wonderful and a great privilege to listen to you, Mr. President. And I think it's a great privilege for me to be here at this incredibly historic moment in Colombia's history. I loved what you said at the beginning. Peter Bauer and Amartya Sen are two of my great heroes. The last chapter of The Great Escape is very much influenced by Peter Bauer. Amartya Sen, I've known, it feels like, since I was a child, and has shaped so much of my thinking, and it's wonderful to see his thoughts and ideas bearing fruition here. I have been a great advocate of the multidimensional poverty indicators that you talked about. One of the things that's not always made clear when we measure poverty is not just that you can't just do it in income and you can't just do it in health, but if you put all these things together, the people who are deprived in one dimension are the same people who are deprived in another dimension. People who have no money are also the people who have the shortest lives. They're also the people who don't get to participate in democracy. And you were talking about those people. Those are the people that you now have the chance to bring into the economy and help them make the Great Escape too. And these multidimensional poverty measures, it sounds very technical, and I've always worried a little bit that they were not the natural tools for policymakers to think about. So to hear the President of the Republic talk about multidimensional poverty, I think is just wonderful. And he also talked a part of it that I have never really thought of, which is that it's not only that you truly gauge the depth of deprivation by capturing all the ways in which people are poor, but you can also use it as a better target for policy by deciding which parts of the multidimensional bundle you're going to really target. So I was very hopeful before I came here this morning. Having heard this speech, I'm tremendously hopeful, and I wish Colombia and its president and its people, that everyone will make the Great Escape and have a bright and democratic future within the OECD. It's going to be wonderful. Thank you very much. So they were not counted in the census or in any of the surveys and so on. So it was simply impossible to run a true democracy with that sort of deficient data. And so it seems like there's a real parallel here, and that it's very important, once you come through this process, to get proper censuses, proper surveys, in which everyone's included. Otherwise, in the end, you're not going to know whether you're succeeding or failing on all the issues we talked about. I'm enormously attracted by Samuel's concept of social entrepreneurship and the extent to which it resolves some of the rent-seeking problems that I'm talking about, sort of short circuits a lot of things that you would expect to go wrong by sort of hard baking the politics into the entrepreneurship in a way that can act in everyone's interest. But he said something at the very end that I've been thinking about ever since he said it. It's this, and it's come up in almost all of the comments, which is the extent to which you do want to decentralize and you don't want to decentralize. It's true that neighborhoods have all this information and they know themselves and they know their own citizens. And so as much as possible, you'd really like to have neighborhoods do for themselves. But there's some things that neighborhoods can't do for themselves, and this comes back to the collective action issue, which came up here, which is really, really important. I mean, public health cannot really be dealt with at the neighborhood level, because there are things that really have to be dealt with at the national level. There's a lot of things, and health is perhaps the leading one, that you cannot do for yourself. I mean, it's no good you can't protect yourself against the disease if no one else is protecting themselves against the disease. And you can't provide your own sewer if your neighbors are not using lavatories, for instance. And there's a lot of stuff like that. Now, some of that can be done at the local level, but some of it needs national level to do. Electricity provision, I mean, there are things like that that really have to be done collectively at the national level and not just at the neighborhood level. And also, there are bad neighborhoods. They're not just good neighborhoods. So, civil rights in the United States would never have come to the South if there hadn't been enforcement from the center, for instance, against the wishes of neighborhoods. And so I think that's probably the right way of thinking about aid here, which is, just working out those principles of subsidiarity or whatever you call them. To what extent are you going to let localities, you can't, I really do believe you cannot develop someone else's country from the outside. I mean, I think that's true. But maybe you can develop someone else's neighborhood from the outside or help. And if a neighborhood's overrun by bandits, and, bandits came out. Bandits, of course, are the original rent seekers. I mean, they're the ones that are not creating anything. They're just redistributing things in their own favor. And I wish I'd, brought the bandits more into my talk as opposed to just rent seeking. But bandits can take over whole neighborhoods. And, if you decentralize too far, you're basically playing into the hands of the bandits, whether those bandits are mayors or local politicians or out-and-out bandits who are redistributing at the point of a gun. So I wanted to say a little bit about that. I also it's a weakness of The Great Escape that I didn't think enough about education. And I knew that when I was writing it, but it was also I didn't know how to stop it getting to be 50% larger than it is. And education is terrifically important, and you're going to have a lot of people to educate in Colombia who haven't been educated before, and you're going to have to pay for that somehow, and you have to make sure it's well done and it's well delivered. So I can't really say much more than just say how important that is. Let me say something finally about mobility, which and the contrast that you raised about mobility versus inequality, and that we don't care so much about inequality if there's a lot of mobility, because we're all getting our turn at being at the top and being at the bottom. I wish I thought that were true, and I'm not sure it is. And it comes back to the point about data too, and especially longitudinal data. It's very, very hard to document more mobility, income mobility, over a few years, even maybe a decade or so. And the best studies have been the ones that look at fathers versus sons, or generational mobility, and the extent to which that's really true. I mean, otherwise you have the risk of, someone forgets to tell you that they had any income in that year. They get classed as really, really poor, and then you come back next year and it turns out that they had a whole lot of income and they report it this year, and then you say, oh, look at all that mobility. That really poor person is really rich this year, and of course they weren't really poor last year and they're not really rich this year. You're just looking at measurement error, and measurement error generates a tremendous amount of false mobility. But two points. I mean, one is there's some work being done which is more or less credible, suggesting that the more unequal societies are the ones with the least intergenerational mobility. And Bob Putnam at Harvard has written a book recently called Our Kids, which is arguing that the extreme and rising inequality in the United States is seriously undermining equality of opportunity. And you can see this in the richest places in the United States, in the richest cities, like in New York, where the rich have basically priced everybody out of the best schools. So it's incredibly hard. I have grandchildren in that age range, so I've suffered through the agonies of this with their parents, of just trying to get kids into good schools. And right now, there's so many really rich people in New York, that money doesn't even help very much. I mean, you can go down to one of these good schools and offer them $1 million, and it doesn't cut any ice because someone's offered them $10 million or something. But there's a real concern, and Bob Putnam talks about this in his book. He grew up in a poor town in Ohio, and his parents were not very well heeled and were working, respectable working people. And it was quite common in his high school for kids to go to Ivy League schools. And he became a Harvard professor. That would not be true from that school anymore. Joe Stiglitz tells me that in his school in Gary, Indiana, there were 5 National Merit Scholars, which is the sort of measure of what you would have at that age. And Joe was one of them. And now that school is not sending anyone to college anymore, let alone to Harvard or to wherever, So there's a real sense, it's true that you don't want to worry about inequality so much if there's a lot of mobility, but you worry that one of the instrumental consequences of extreme inequality is that it does undermine the equality of opportunity by the rich getting all the places in the best schools sort of idea. One of the things that's happened in the US is the best schools are leaning over very hard to admit a lot of minorities, people who were historically excluded, which is, a very good thing to do. On the other hand, they have to pay for that by charging very high fees to the very rich kids. So you get Ivy League schools that are dominated by very poor kids and very rich kids, and there's almost no one in the middle. And that's one of the reasons that the white working class in the United States feels like it's getting no favors at all, and it's being excluded from this mobility thing. And I think that can be very serious. But I take the point, and I should have said more about mobility. So thank you all very much. This has been a terrific conversation. I really appreciate it.